Hello everyone and welcome to Saturn Returns with me, Caggie Dunlop. This is a podcast that aims to bring clarity during transitional times where there can be confusion and doubt. Today I'm joined by Louise O'Neill, who is a renowned author and journalist. In this episode, we discuss Louise's journey during her Saturn return. At 27, she was living back with her parents after returning from her job in fashion journalism in New York. Her relationship had ended, a dwindling bank account, and suffering from a severe relapse in her eating disorder. It was a rock bottom that many of us experienced during our Saturn return. And she very openly discusses her experience during this time. Our Saturn return can be an incredibly turbulent and also transformative time in our lives. Louise speaks very openly about how there were times where she felt hopeless and lost, even when she was at one of her highest points of success professionally, because she firmly holds the belief that sometimes everything falls apart and comes together at the same time. And I often talk about this, that we can have the facade, we can be experiencing external success, but if something is off internally, we won't feel emotionally anchored or grounded. Louise very openly reflects on her 20-year battle with an eating disorder, which affected every aspect of her life. She shares her recent experience from her Saturn Maturation, which is when we go into our next visit from Saturn at 37 after our Saturn return, which is also a profound time of self-reflection, introspection, and reevaluation. In this episode, we discuss toxic relationship patterns, our inner critics, energetic shielding, and how to deepen our female intuition. A big theme of this conversation is that happiness is ultimately an inside job. Thank you very much, Louise, for having this very honest and vulnerable conversation with me. And to those of you who are listening, please take caution if you are affected by subjects of addiction and eating disorders. You might find this episode triggering. Louise, welcome to the Saturn Returns podcast. We're very excited to have you. How are you doing?
I'm very well. I just saw that Emma Roberts, did you see this? She was talking about her Saturn Returns. I thought very on brand.
I know, she's been she did that post and honestly so many press pieces around it. And I'm just here like, hello, come talk to me. But it's good, because it kind of puts the whole concept on the map because, I really wanted to speak to you today specifically about your Saturn Returns journey because, of course, like the overarching theme of the podcast and it often comes back to Saturn Return, but we haven't had that many episodes where we really home in on someone's Saturn Return experience. And it sounds like it was like a big moment for you, right?
Yeah. And you know what's interesting is that I'm really into I'm a lapsed Catholic. I was very religious as a child. And then I think sort of in the early 2000s when a lot of stories were coming out about, the sex abuse scandals and the Magdalene laundries, I left the church. And then New Age spirituality, I think really when I was around 15 or 16, sort of filled that void. So I've been really interested in, I suppose stuff that you would say is quite woo-woo for decades now. But I'd never heard of, when I was going through my Saturn return, I hadn't heard of it. It would have really helped. It definitely would have helped.
Because I wonder sometimes when people come to the live shows and stuff, they'll say, I've put a marker in my calendar. I know when it's going to happen. Should I be afraid? I'm like, no, I was never intending to sort of terrify people or make them sort of Saturnophobic, but it was really intended to make people feel okay about the whole situation and the things that might come up. So would you be able to kind of share with us a little bit about that experience for you?
Sure. I think it's interesting now, as I said, because at the time I didn't know. And now looking back, I can see how there was really big life events kind of happening on either side of it. So like when I was 27, I had been working in New York for a fashion magazine, and I moved home to start writing my first, which would become my first book. But like I'd had an eating disorder. I'd sort of had a relapse while I was working in New York, had come home. My boyfriend had broken up with me. I didn't have any money, and I had to move back in with my parents at the age of 27. And then I think when everything kind of falls apart like that, you think this is a really good opportunity maybe to rebuild my life in the way that I want to. So I started writing. But then on the other side of it, when I was 31, I'd had another relapse. And I think anyone who has struggled with addiction, or anyone who has struggled with an eating disorder, understands, I suppose, that relapse is really part of the cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose often I think when, particularly the first time that we go into rehab, or the first time that we go into recovery, there's this real sense of hope that it'll be like one and done.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think that with every new relapse, like a little bit of hope sort of diminishes, both in yourself and I think in the people around you, because they trust you less. They sort of, I think, have diminished faith each time that you relapse, that, you know, that I suppose maybe the full recovery is even possible.
Yeah, it's like, it feels like your word means less, you know? And I actually, it's interesting that this is kind of coming up, because I had a conversation yesterday. We had Alex Light, I don't know if you know her, and she was talking about eating disorders. And then I was on the phone to my mum, and she'd invited me to a talk, and it was all around like someone who'd recovered from their eating disorder. And she told me that basically how it apparently goes statistically is like a third of people will recover, a third of people will learn to just live with it in a way that's kind of they can cope, and a third of people will actually die. And I was so shocked by that. And I don't think we recognize or realize what the high like mortality rate to it, and like what a complex thing it is to struggle with. So I mean, thank you for speaking about that, because I think, like you say, with anything that people struggle with addiction and stuff, and then you do relapse, it knocks your confidence in yourself and your ability to kind of actually recover. But I always like the saying that healing isn't linear, you know, and like you said, it's part of the process sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm sure it is very, I mean, you know, when I talk to my parents and my sister in particular, because I developed an eating disorder when I was 14. And I went into proper recovery when I was 32. And there were other times where I might have had 6 months where I felt like, oh, I think this is going to be it, or I think I'm going to be okay. And then I would relapse again. And then I suppose the whole cycle of like the secrecy and the lying would start. And my dad always said that was the part that hurt him the most, because he said, you were such an honest child. He said, you were too honest. He said, you know, you just always said exactly what was on your mind. And he said, it really makes me so sad that now as an adult that like, I just don't know whether to believe you or not. And that their instinct, I think, towards the end was
not
just to, yeah, which I think is really sad.
So at 27, that was kind of all going on.
Yes, I had started that. When I talk about the 6 months of kind of having a period of recovery, I had started seeing a really excellent therapist when I was in New York, and she was just amazing. And then I had to come home because my visa expired, and you know, all of these things. And she said to me, she was like, you are very early in recovery. You need support. You need like a team around you. You need to find a therapist and a nutritionist when you go home. And then, I don't know, I suppose I came home and I think I got a bit cocky. You know, I just thought, no, I'm okay. I'm doing really well. You know, this will be fine. I don't really need anyone. I don't need that support right now. And I relapsed, I'd say, within 6 weeks maybe of coming home. Yeah. I came home at the end of August, and I had relapsed by my parents' anniversary, which is October.
If you don't mind me asking, what did relapsing look like for you?
Well, mine, see, it kind of depended because, I mean, as I said, I had it for like 17 years. So it sort of went between like severe restriction and then binging and purging. And then there was maybe exercise, a compulsion at times, but it was really restriction and then binge purge. So that was what it was. That was what it was like for me. And it just, I mean, it's so interesting talking about it now because, as I said, it started when I was 14. My parents asked me to start seeing a therapist when I was 17. I was hospitalized for 3 months when I was 21. And then I went to New York when I was around 25, had a very bad relapse. I mean, I remember when I left, my mother did say, do you think working in a fashion industry, like, do you think that'll help? And I said, don't worry, it'll be totally fine. And she was right, it did not help. So I had a very bad relapse while I was there of like really, really restricting, like just eating just very, very little. And also I think having such a just completely messed up idea around like what a meal would constitute, like talking to my therapist, and I would say, oh, I did really well, I didn't binge and purge. And she would say, okay, well, what did you eat? And I would sort of run through what I'd had that day. And she like, a grapefruit is not a meal. Oh, is it not? So because I mean, honestly, because I'd had it, I mean, as I said, when I went into full recovery, I was 32. So I'd had an eating disorder for 17 years and I had like been healthy for 14 years. So for the majority of my life and for the like entirety of my adult life, I'd had an eating disorder. So I think, when we talk about recovery, again, what you're saying, that like a third of people will recover, a third of people, will learn how to live with it. I thought that maybe I would fit into that category because I just thought at this point, like the neural pathways, around this addiction are so firmly embedded, like laid down. Yeah, I have no idea how I would ever sort of rewire them. And I did. And like, I think it's really important to tell people that because I think like it's so easy to lose hope and it's so easy to think I've had it for too long and I'm too sick. And, as I said, it's too embedded. But full recovery is possible. And I remember when I started seeing this new therapist around the time of my Saturn return, I was 32, and she asked me to bring my parents to see her. And they came in and, I mean, it was very shaming, like in a way, because I suppose you think that you're hiding so much of your behavior. And then I think to sit with my parents while they spoke.
You realised that they knew.
They knew, yeah. And it was really like and they were so kind about it, but it was so, because you think, oh God, who else knows?
Yeah, so confronting.
Are people talking about me? Yeah. Are people talking about me behind my back? And she said to them, like, she asked me to leave so she could talk to them. And, my dad just said, look, we just want her to live as normal a life as she can at this point, And my therapist said to them, and they told me this afterwards, she said, oh, full recovery is possible. And she said, I believe that Louise will fully recover. And it was something about the certainty with which she said that for my parents, but she reiterated that to me. And I think having someone who can hold that hope for you when that hope seems so impossible and outlandish, it's a lifeline.
100%. I think, hope is the most important thing in those moments in time. So what was that journey like to healing?
I mean, it was long and it was hard. I'll be 6 years recovered in June. And, it's funny because no matter what happens in my life now, I've been through sort of difficult experiences, and I can see sometimes people will worry around me like, oh, will this cause? And to me, that seems so impossible because my recovery feels so rock solid. But it was challenging. Like, I suppose there was two parts to it. The first part to it, which sounds so basic, was I had to refeed myself. because there's been really interesting studies done. The Minnesota starvation study, which was done, I think, in the 1940s, where they took this group of conscientious objectors from the war. I think they were American. They basically restricted their calories. Just these very ordinary men, had no history of mental health issues or eating problems. And like within a few weeks, like the men became really obsessive about their food. They started hoarding their food. They started what we would describe as almost binging on the food whenever they got access to it. So like, I suppose often when we talk about eating disorders, we're very focused on the psychological aspects of it, which are obviously very important. But like the physical part, like you're malnourished. Mm-hmm. And when you're malnourished, you can't make good decisions. Your brain isn't functioning properly. So like a big part of it was working with a dietitian and really sticking to my meal plan. And then the other part was just challenging every single eating disorder thought that arose, every single one, which like there were a lot of them.
Can you give me an example?
So let's say if I was sitting down to eat and let's say I was sitting with my sister and a friend of ours, and my sister is like, oh, I'm not very hungry. I had a big breakfast or something. And the eating disorder thought would be, why does she get to just eat a salad and you have to eat this? She's going to get thinner than you, and then everyone's going to think she's more, really, competitive.
Is she really not hungry, or is she just
yeah, and feeling really jealous that other people could just say I'm not hungry? You're like, well, why can't I say that? Because I have an eating disorder and she doesn't. And then I think it was really sitting with that. And like the question that I asked myself over and over again is this ultimately true? And there was always like evidence, or there was always, like I think, oh no, that can't be true, because you would always find like some sort of reason, or as I said, some sort of evidence that would break down this idea or this thought that you'd had. Like if I'd say, well, if I eat that, I'm going to be fat. And then I would think, oh, well, my dad's eating it and he's not fat. And like, as obviously time went on, I think began to interrogate, well, there's nothing wrong with being fat. But I think in the beginning, it was very much trying to like break down, as I said, the kind of evidence, looking at other people and being like, well, she's eating a normal meal and she's fine. So like, I should be safe if I do this as well. So I think it was really trying to challenge all of those thoughts.
Yeah, because it's recognizing that those thoughts are now completely irrational.
Yeah.
And actually the ones that are governing you, because it can sort of be as like, you think if you eat that thing, or if you do, you actually look at yourself and you feel like you look different, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's why it's so complicated, because you're having to really dismantle that voice that has been the main voice in your head.
Yeah. And I think it is like, I mean, having gone through this, and I mean, I have a couple of close friends who are in recovery as well. Both are recovering alcoholics. Like, it really reinforces, I think, just my belief in the human capacity to change. Because I think often we just say, oh, this is just the way I am. And it does take a lot of time and effort and energy to, as I keep saying, like, it's rewiring those neural pathways, Yeah. And I think that when you've done it once, and I have seen, because I have done it, like, I do not worry about food now. I don't think about food. I don't think about my weight. I mean, I haven't weighed myself in 6 years. And like, the freedom from all of that is absolutely extraordinary. And I suppose, again, it's just trying to because I feel like so many women I know are, they might not have an eating disorder, but they struggle with some kind of, disordered eating or poor body image, because, and I think we're all under like an immense amount of pressure to sort of adhere to, what are conventional beauty standards, and unfortunately thinness is like a real part of that.
100%. Because I definitely felt that a big one for me during my Saturn return was actually changing that self-talk. Very, like, it wasn't as extreme, but I had a quite tortured relationship with my body from probably the age of about 16, 17. And it was like, I'd become so disconnected from just trusting what it needed when it needed. And it became this, like, not this sort of feast or famine, but it was, again, it was like people wouldn't have known, but the voice in my head was like a kind of constant of, well, you can't do that until you're thinner.
Yeah.
Or you can't go there, or you can't get a boyfriend, or like, no, you're not worthy of that. You have to be, you know, all of these kind of rules and restrictions that were just in my mind. And it was during my Saturn Return where I was like, I don't want to live like this.
Yeah.
I don't want to live limiting myself or speaking to myself in this way that nobody even knows about because I looked normal.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, the sort of the sinister aspect of it is that, of course, in everyone it manifests differently and to varying degrees, but it can still, for a lot of people that are just going around their life day to day, you may have no idea that this kind of stuff is going on. And it kind of breaks my heart to hear, you know, your experience and to think of anyone else going through it as well. But at the same time, that there's hope in healing and that you can. And it's interesting because the terminology you use is very intertwined with addiction and recovery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is there a reason for that? Because I actually phrased it the other day in a conversation. I said, you know, I do liken it to an addiction. The only more complicated aspect is it's something you have to address every day, 3 times a day.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I very deliberately use, as you said, like recovery and addiction language around it. And actually my therapist, who is a specialist in eating disorders, asked me about that once. And I said, well, like there is firstly, all addictions, like we use them to numb pain. You know, whether that's like when people are addicted to literal painkillers, but like it is sometimes the world just feels too much, too cruel, too loud, too harsh, and we're not sure of how we can sort of survive in it. So in order to, like, you know, drown out the noise, or in order to numb some of the pain, we use this behavior, whatever that is, whether that is sex or drink or drugs or food. So to me, they all feel very linked. But particularly, I think the bulimia and the binge project, that felt very addictive because there was a real desperation around it, and the planning of the you know, the binges, and, you know, having to find time and space to be alone, and, you know, resenting anyone who, you know, intruded on that. So like when I talk to people who are drug addicts or alcoholics, like it feels very similar. Yeah.
That's so fascinating. If you don't mind me asking, I tend to ask quite personal questions on this show, but when you kind of went through the recovery process, what did you find was at the core of the behavior? You know, what was the underlying feeling or pain that you were trying to escape through this?
Oh, I think it's the human condition. I'm not good enough. Like, I think that is at the core of
so much.
Like, I really think when you boil down like anything, it sort of comes down to this feeling of, oh, I'm just not good enough. And trying to make yourself good enough in, you know, for me, it was like, you know, academic achievement, or the way in which I looked, and, you know, making sure that my body presented a certain way. And I think at the core, and then, you know, like getting into, you know, sort of very messy romantic entanglements where I just really, like, it felt like very obsessive, and where I, you know, there was no real promise of commitment, or, you know, anything like that. And it was really because I thought, well, I'm not good enough, and this person clearly recognizes that I'm not good enough. And if I can make this person love me, then maybe I can believe I'm worth. Like, it's so good. Like, it's so almost cliche. You know, the way you're like, oh God, I'm just like everybody else.
No, it's not, though, because I don't think everybody else is able to articulate it or recognize that, you know. And I think you're so right. We're also sort of, if you think about the media and films growing up, it was always the very popular storyline was like the girl that was a bit of a misfit, but somehow got, made herself hot and like got the guy, So every girl is like, oh, well, if a guy's being a bit aloof and treating me not very well, but they'll eventually pick me and then I'll sort of transform.
Yeah.
And it really gets you into a mess, like messy entanglements, and allowing yourself to sort of justify the unjustifiable.
Yes. And I think actually it's funny when you were talking, because that all kind of was happening around my like 30, 31. And I think so much of it as well was like, Oprah always says like, happiness is an inside job. And I think that I was really looking for happiness in like my career and in success and in the way I looked and the way men responded to me, or, a relationship or whatever. And like, what's interesting is like around the time of my Saturn return, I was going through, I suppose, what looked like from the outside, just the most incredible period of my entire life,
Success.
Yeah. Like, my second novel had really taken off, and it sort of become almost like a cultural it started like a cultural conversation in Ireland. And, it really took off. It was sort of in the top 10 for like a year, and they made a documentary inspired by it. And I suppose, as I said, to the outside, it just looked like everything was going just so perfectly well. And I was falling apart. Like I just couldn't. I mean, it's funny, even when I say it there, I can feel like my heart kind of just start to race a little bit quicker, just even like just remembering, like just, I think it just felt like I had a target on my back. It felt like I was so exposed. I felt really vulnerable. And I was eating less and less and less. And like the bulimia was coming back in again. And it was just such a nightmare. And I think it really, sometimes I think when you get everything that you think you want and you stop and you say, oh, but I'm still not happy. I still feel like I have this hole inside me. And I've tried to fill it with the addiction, and now I've tried to fill it with success. And I've tried to fill it with like affection or love or whatever. And nothing is like touching the size of this hole. Like it really feels like, I don't know, it just makes you think, well, then I'll never be happy. It's just this awful kind of moment of reckoning. And I think it was at that point that I thought, oh, I have to recover, because I think that it was quite a fatalistic. I thought, well, I'll either recover or I'll die. At that point, it kind of felt like there wasn't going to be anywhere in between.
Did you feel like the success was making it worse in a way?
Yes. I mean, there was many different aspects to that. I mean, part of it was, being on TV and getting my photo taken, and, finding that really triggering, and thinking, well, if I'm thinner, I don't have to worry, that I'll take, that thing of like, oh, you look however many pounds heavier in a photograph. Whereas, so I thought, oh, well, at least if I'm
and
thinner,
if you have an eating disorder, you think you look 1,000 pounds heavier.
Exactly. And just being really, I don't know, like really kind of confronted by that. And like, whenever I would see a bad photo, I wasn't able to sort of say, oh, it's just a bad photo. Like it would just make me feel so, like the self-loathing was so intense. And then the only way that I found to deal with the self-loathing was the eating disorder. And then, because of the nature of that book, which was, dealing with sexual violence, I would do events and I would have a lot of people coming up to me, telling me their stories. And it was, it was really, I feel really honored. Like I do.
But it's a lot.
It is. And I would go back to my empty hotel room and I remember just feeling like really hollowed out. And again,
you don't even know what's your energy and what someone else's at that point.
Yes.
You feel that like emotion and you're like, I want to cry. Am I crying or am I crying for someone else? Like, what is this?
Yeah. And I think, well, firstly, I'm not a trained therapist, but I also think now I'm very good at like energetic shielding and, like really kind of taking care of my energy in that way.
It's no joke, that stuff. Like you've got to have your spiritual hygiene, because when you're dealing with that kind of responsibility and those stories, It's a lot to take on.
Yeah. So, now I'll go back and I'll have like, I'll have like my like little stick of incense and like a bath, and, I kind of have like a whole ritual to sort of feel like I'm like cleansing. But yeah, I think, I suppose the only way in which I had to, I think both, I suppose zone out or even just recover from that kind of feeling was like, oh, the eating disorder. Like that's the kind of the comfort. That's the thing to go to. That's the relief. That's the respite. And it's so, I always say this with addiction, or, you wouldn't do it unless it had worked in the beginning, and it did at one point, it did like give some sort of comfort. And then it becomes this sort of, vicious cycle where it's causing the harm, it's causing the pain, and it's pretending to be the antidote to it as well.
Yeah. But like you say, at some point it was the only thing, and there's a reason. But man, I know that space. I know it well. It's incredibly painful.
Yeah. And we're not taught how to self-soothe. And I think that's such a valuable lesson. And like, children should be taught that in school, like how to self-soothe without needing an external source or substance, that you have this ability within yourself to care for yourself.
Especially if you're creative, sensitive, emotional person that feels everything very deeply, but doesn't know how to kind of process the emotion, then unfortunately we do. That's why addiction in varying degrees is so rife, because people aren't taught how to regulate their systems.
Yeah.
And also we get very used to this very cruel internal dialogue that gives us this illusion of control, but is actually so damaging and robs us of so many things, of so much joy in life.
Yeah. But I think, it's like, obviously sometimes I look back and I think, oh, it's sad that I spent, all of my teens and all of my 20s struggling with this. It feels like such a waste of a time where I should have felt free, and I should have, been out having fun, and I should have, just making mistakes, and, I did plenty of that as well, but anyway. But I think now I actually feel really grateful for the experience, because I have these incredible tools in my life, like I always describe it as like the scaffolding that kind of holds my life together, so that when things go wrong, and they have, I feel so steady, because I have, my therapy, I have, yoga, I have meditation, I have, like acupuncture or Reiki or reflex, like I have all of these kind of things around me, and like my journaling, and just, I don't know, like going to swimming in the sea. Like I have all of these things that I do, and I do them consistently, to the point where they've become so automatic that when something goes wrong, I still do reach for those things, like I think that is what has been just so helpful.
And that's such a sort of Saturn Returns thing, because I relate very deeply to all of those things as my infrastructure and the foundations that I live by. So when things do go a little bit off, or I'm not feeling very good in my head, or I've had an argument with my boyfriend or whatever, I know the practices and the tools to come back to. Whereas in my 20s, I'd like, I don't know, go out and get completely off my head, and then next day feel awful and hate myself, and then eat loads and loads of food and then feel worse. And then, do you know what I mean? Like that. I look back and I'm like, why did no one tell me these things then?
Yeah, it's kind of, as you said, it just makes everything worse. It's that kind of like a vicious cycle.
It is a vicious cycle. But in terms of the relationship piece, because I know our audience is always, this is always a very popular subject and something I find quite fascinating, because you said you would get in these quite toxic entanglements. Would you be able to kind of share a little bit more about what that was like and where you're at now with it?
No, I mean, I think that's definitely part of the past. I mean, I think whenever I would meet someone before I recovered, whenever I would meet someone who was lovely to me, I would think, oh, this is boring. Like, this is very dull. They are far too nice to me. And I also think they're, because of that sense of like low self-worth, what's that? That was a Groucho Marx, like, I don't want to be part of any club that will have me. So there was a part that was like,
I've never heard that.
Yeah, so I think it was almost like, well, if this guy likes me, I mean, what's wrong with him?
Yeah, what's wrong with you?
You have no standards, clearly. And yes, I think I always wanted that like challenge, and someone playing like really hard to get. And it was, again, like, someone who clearly didn't care about me. And there was a few of them that I'm thinking of maybe 3. And I was just so determined to like make them absolutely love me. And like, the more that they were like,
and then you'd be okay.
Yeah.
Then you'd be fixed.
Yeah. And of course the thing is that if they had, I would have lost.
You wouldn't like them.
Exactly. I would have lost interest.
You'd be like, you like me? What's wrong with you?
So it just would, like, I would have been like, okay, next. So yeah, I think it was really just like learning to, I don't know, to really sit with it and to think, okay, what is it I want? And also really believing that like I deserved love, that I deserved to be treated well, that I deserved to be, treated with respect, and I deserved to have my needs met. And that was a big thing for me, because, I was just really used to, and I think maybe a lot of women are like this, we're kind of conditioned to take care of other people's worries and other people's concerns. And I'm a real caretaker. Like, I love taking care of people. So I think that has been sort of a lifelong, because, with all of this, we're constantly learning. Like, it's I don't think that there is a moment where you think, oh, I'm done, I've got it all sorted,
and when you do, watch out.
Yes.
That's when the next big lesson is coming. But also the sort of cruel irony of this whole thing is that often, to really know our own worth and to get into a place of deservingness, we are confronted by a situation that makes us feel our worst. Do you know what I mean? It's only in those moments where you've hit the rock bottom and you're like, no, this cannot be it.
Yeah.
I think people, it would just come along and they just see that person, they're like, yeah, I feel deserving and you're wonderful and woohoo.
Yes, that would be lovely. But I don't know. I mean, this year has been a little bit tumultuous, and I'm trying to sit with it. Like, I'm trying to just think everything that is happening and everything that is being cleared from my life is for my higher good. And it almost feels, I mean, I just turned 38 in February, but it almost feels like Saturn Return Part 2.
Well, you'll have gone through a Saturn maturation. So Saturn has squares and oppositions. So at 36, 37,
oh my God,
you do go through. Yeah. So
well, there you go. Okay, this makes sense, because like a long-term relationship just broke up. And I keep thinking when we were, getting ready for this interview, I just thought, like, Saturn Returns really reminds me of the Tower card in the tarot. And I have this book. I'm actually going to read you a little section from it, because I just love this explanation of the Tower. Because I think people who aren't familiar with the tarot are always really afraid of the Death card. Whereas actually, I think the Tower card is like the one where I'm like, oh no. So in my book, which is Karina Collins, this Irish woman, and it says, when the Tower card appears, it means fate has, or soon will, intervene to force change which in your heart is overdue. Ultimately, what transpires sends you in a new direction, hurtling you towards your true destiny. The Tower strips away any false sense of security in your home, relationships, work, belief system, or sense of self. It may feel like the universe is out to get you, as events come with speed, one thing after the other. The problems cannot be dodged, but must be faced and dealt with. And at first you may resist, but then you become excited as you start to see the potential of what is unfolding before you. Higher powers are protecting you, stretching you, and directing you towards a situation more amazing than you ever could have dreamt of. So everything is falling apart and coming together at the same time. So I was like, that is very Saturn Return.
That is so Saturn Return. That's what one of the chapters in my book is, things fall apart so better things can come together. So when anyone's going through it, I'm always like a little bit excited because I know that something fantastic is around the corner. And I think if we can get more into that state of mind to kind of be open to the possibility of what might be unfolding, it kind of just changes your whole perspective on life, doesn't it?
Yeah. And someone said to me recently that life is not happening to you, it's happening for you. And again, I think it's that kind of shift in perspective, because it's very easy to kind of, get into self-pity and get into sort of victim mode. And it's really trying to think, okay, well, what is this here to teach me? Like, what is it that I have to learn so that I don't repeat the patterns, in my next relationship or in my next career or in my next job or, whatever like the case may be. And I think that when you can try and look at it like that, as you said, it feels almost exciting. Like in the midst of the chaos, it can feel kind of exciting.
And it's hard to do, because I also wrote in the book a lot about victim mentality, because that was something I would very much fall into. And in my 20s, it was like everything was happening to me, nothing was happening for me. And again, that sort of reframe invites more positivity. It's just that shift, that gear shift. Like, okay, I don't know why this is happening. It's a shitstorm right now, but I trust, to be in trust that it's going to be okay. So, I'm sorry that you're going through that, but I'm glad that you've got to a place where you're like inviting it in and excited about, I think when you get excited about the space,
Yes, the universe abhors a vacuum.
Yeah. And you can feel like almost, I think you can feel energetically like something that hasn't quite arrived, but its energy is almost there.
Yeah. I love that.
And how about the sort of career stuff? Because I'm curious to know, you said that when you were like at a rock bottom was when things were actually going very well. How have you managed to kind of get through that upper limit that you had to really step into that place and kind of fully embody it and feel deserving of that success?
Well, I think for a while after, like that was 2016. And I think for like a couple of years afterwards, I had to take a step back. Like my health had to be my first priority. And I think I made my life smaller in a way to make it more manageable. Like I kept my kind of the group of people around me very tight and moved back to my hometown. And just really, I think, protected myself as much as I could. And now I think over the last, couple of years, like, particularly with Idol, which was, my last book, I think that I have really felt much more able to step into my power and to step into my ambition and to say, I want to be successful. I want this to do well. I want this book to be read and, all of those things. And I think and again, I think trying to do that while also blocking out all the outside noise. Because I think, and I'm sure, I can't even imagine what it's like, for someone like you, but, there were a lot of, like trolls or, like these message boards and, all of that kind of thing. And I think that once you start getting worried about what, a huge, I don't know how many people, like what they think of you,
you won't do anything.
Yeah, because you can't hear your own voice. You can't hear your own. And like that has been like the thing for this year that I've really, at the start of every year, I pick a word that I want to focus on.
Yeah, I love that.
And at the start of this year, I picked intuition because I felt like I had really like stopped listening to myself and stopped listening to my heart and, and been very led by what the people around me were thinking, and people who loved me, like, it wasn't that they had bad intentions, they had really good intentions, but like sort of being led by what they thought or their morals or their ideas or their opinions, rather than actually sitting and thinking, what is right for me? What do I need? Like, what is the right next step for me? And I think so that has been this year, like really trying to, I think, prioritize that is like, yeah, but what is my intuition telling me? What are my instincts saying? And I just think we're so trained out of that, like in every aspect of our lives. And it's really sad.
There's this beautiful Glennon Doyle quote, which is stop asking people directions to places they've never been. And I think it's just like, it's so true. But to listen to our intuition, when you do get out of the habit of it or you disconnect from it, it can be a tricky journey back. So I think that's really powerful, and actually just setting a really simple, clear intention and like kind of repeating and reminding yourself of that. Do you have any practices for sort of deepening that intuitive knowing?
Well, actually, do you know what I have started doing is somatic therapy. And that has been really interesting because it's very much, how does it feel in your body?
Which again is not, we're so tapped out of our bodies. We live just like,
I know, but floating heads. And like a friend of mine who's very intuitive, she said, oh, if something doesn't feel right for me, I'll get like a clenching in my stomach. And I'm like, oh my God, I wish I had something that was so obvious and clear. And like, oh, maybe not. So the somatic therapy has been really helpful because it keeps coming back into, what does that feel like in your body? And sometimes you think you're making it up. She's like, oh, what color is it? And I'm like, gray. Whatever, like the first thing that comes to my head. But also like, and it's such a, I do find, with like meditation, like I learned how to do transcendental meditation a couple of years ago, and it's such a, I really wish that like my answers were, more fun. Like, sit in silence and then the answers will come. But yeah, I do think the meditation has been interesting. But I'm very hopeful about the somatics. I think there's something about learning when something feels right or doesn't, or feels, wrong in your body. And again, as particularly as women, I think, when we're put into situations where we've felt uncomfortable, or like, I think, our those instincts are there. I think it's just learning how to hone them.
Yeah, and not squash them.
Yeah.
And a really simple practice that I think people, for the audience listening to take away is, I love intuitive dance. So actually putting on music, moving. So if you feel that you are very disconnected with your body, it's a great way of starting up that dialogue again and communicating and just noticing the sensations and the feeling. And then when you need to make a decision later on, like, you're more sort of tapped in, I think.
Yeah. Have you ever tried 5 rhythms?
I haven't. I know about it though, but I have been to and done similar things, but I would actually enjoy going to 5 rhythms. I went into the yoga class the other day, and at the end she made everyone put their hands up like this and just dance for like 10 minutes. And it was so fun. I loved it. So yeah, I've got to give 5 rhythms a go.
Yeah, there's something about it where, it's both that you're getting in touch with your body, and also I think learning not to care what other people think. And I mean, listen, I'm Irish. That is, and I'm from a small, like, that is hard to sort of like, I was doing this yoga, this restorative yoga class the other day, and there was a woman next to me, and she was a really heavy breather. So every time they said, breathe out, she's like, and I was lying there going, this is not helpful. I am thinking homicidal thoughts. And afterwards I was like, what is this woman? And I think it's trying to think, that's okay. It's okay. We're all allowed to take up space. And I think it's learning to actually do, because again, I suppose what I realized, because I sat with it afterwards and I thought, what I felt resentful about was that she was prioritizing her own needs and not worrying about, whereas I'm always like, I'm sorry now, I hope I'm not annoying you, or I hope I'm not, So I think it was just seeing someone who was really like owning that space for herself. And I thought, okay, it's always more about you than it is about the other person, I think.
Isn't that the truest thing?
Yeah.
Well, Louise, thank you so, so much for joining me on the Saturn Returns podcast. Is there any kind of final words you have for our listeners? Because I feel like so much of this conversation is going to resonate with them.
Oh, well, I suppose if you are someone, or, someone who is struggling, with an addiction or with an eating disorder, I suppose I always come back to full recovery is possible. And that I think, I suppose it's just holding that hope, which can be so difficult when the situation seems hopeless. But I'll hold that hope for you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I absolutely love this conversation with Louise. I love it when people come on that I don't know and they're just willing to go there, because I know how medicinal and powerful it is to the audience that are going through something similar but perhaps haven't taken the steps that are necessary. And often these episodes are what encourage people to begin their own path of healing. And so I hope if it's resonated with you that you can talk to someone about it or reach out to myself or Louise. I know this is a very, very sensitive and very complex subject that we discuss. And, it very much impacted me when I was a big theme that I discuss in my book, Saturn Returns, is, the relationship I had with my body. And that was a big, big part of my Saturn Returns journey, was addressing that and healing it. Some of the statistics that Louise mentioned in this episode I found particularly staggering. The idea that statistically 1/3 of people recover from an eating disorder, 1/3 learn to live with it, and 1/3 of people die was very, very hard to hear. And I think it's a subject that it affects a lot of people. And so if you are struggling with this, my heart goes out to you, or if you know someone that is, I empathize hugely. But I just wanted to say a big thank you to Louise for being so open and discussing this with me. Also, this concept of, an eating disorder being an addiction. And I remember someone saying, it's with other addictions, whether it's drugs or alcohol, we can cut it out of our lives. Whereas with food, it's something we have to address and face every day, which makes it one of the more complicated of addictions, really. Also, I very much related to her experience with relationships and toxic patterns, this reprogramming of people that were nice and treated you well as not exciting, and how that's a really big part that we have to kind of mature into, and to recognize our own worth and know that we are worthy of being treated incredibly well, and that's something to gravitate towards, not against. I hope this episode resonated with you, and if it did, and you would like to share it with someone who you think might find it useful or healing, please do. And again, a big thank you to Louise for coming on Saturn Returns. If it has been triggering for you, I hope that you can seek some help and support, some professional help, because I know these things are very complicated. Anyway, I'm sending lots of love to all of you, and thank you so much for your continued support of Saturn Returns. It really helps us get discovered by more like-minded people if you could write us a review on Apple Podcasts. And don't forget to subscribe to the solo series if you guys want more from me and Saturn Returns. Thank you so much for listening. And as always, remember, you are not alone. Goodbye.